Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ian White and I'm Master of this college, and may I really welcome you most warmly to this lecture this evening. And for those of you who will be listening on podcast, we are also very grateful indeed for your interest. It means a lot to us that so many have come to honour in many ways the role of Lisa Jardine, our first ever woman fellow of this college, who proved to be such an inspiration to so many students, staff and fellows of the college. Students, indeed, many of whom have come back this evening to hear Baroness Kennedy, but also others that have been contributing so much as a result of her encouragement in so many fields, in so many ways. This is the second lecture that we have had to mark her most untimely passing, and we're so grateful that John, her husband, is here also. Thank you so much for your continuing interest in the college and your support of its events. Lisa, of course, had major roles after being a fellow at Jesus College, both at Queen Mary and at UCL. Her academic work was remarkable in its diversity, in its range of subjects, and her grasp of both the arts and the sciences and indeed the humanities. And that, of course, led her to many important roles, not only on the HRC Council, trustee of the VNA, but in many ways, for me, a very key role of chairing the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, which she did so effectively. However, that role in many ways, just for me, highlighted the inspirational way in which she was able to cross from arts through humanities right to the sciences. It's therefore a particular pleasure for me tonight to welcome this speaker, who of course herself is so inspirational, just as Lisa was. Baroness Helena Kennedy, as we all know, is a leading barrister and an expert in human rights law, civil liberties and constitutional issues. She has been a bencher of Gray's Inn and president of SOAS. She was chair and indeed a member of Charter 88, then the Human Genetics Commission and indeed the British Council from 1998 to 2004. She chaired many major activities, including the Power Inquiry, which reported on the state of British democracy, and produced the Power Report in 2006. And she's rightly received many honours for her work on human rights, not just in the UK, but also in many countries around the world, and indeed holds more than 30 doctorates. In addition to her extraordinary energy in respect of the law, she is, of course, an expert in literature and heavily engaged in it in so many ways, and in the media, and, of course, is supporting so many important charities. Baroness, thank you so much for coming this evening, and we look forward to your lecture very much.
Thank you. Ian, thank you for such a generous welcome and introduction. I always am tickled by the way in which I was once introduced as Helena Kennedy, the lawyer who represents women and other criminals. But yours was very delightful and certainly not as daft. Anyway, but I can't begin to tell you the pleasure it gives me to be giving the Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. I just want to apologise to all of you because I think that Julian at one stage called me or emailed me and said, what would you like to speak about? And I said something like, well, you know, the retreat from rules-based international order or something like that, and it ended up that was the title of this lecture. I'm surprised so many of you came. But anyway, it is of of course, my great passion is the law, and the opportunity of speaking about my concerns about what is currently happening is pressing. But I want to start by just saying that Lisa Jardine was one of my very, very close women friends, and it's an honour to give this lecture in her memory. She lives on in my heart in a very, very real way. I knew her for many years. She was, as you've all said, a great scholar, brilliant academic. She was also a formidable leader, wonderful woman in the women's movement. She was a mentor to many, many young men but especially young women. She was a great public intellectual, and I used to love listening to her on Radio 3, where she used to do that late-night talk. She was a remarkable thinker, and it was partly because she was so innovative and because she brought together ideas from different fields, that originality of the polymath, which meant that she could cross disciplines, and as Ian said, covering science and medicine and the humanities. She knew really about everything, and she was always willing to enter the fray on any subject. She was a truly Renaissance woman, and I miss her daily. I loved her dearly, and she was a great public servant. I think that, of course, she sat on the V&A's board, but she, leading the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, is a difficult and sensitive task around ethics and law. And there was an attempt made at one stage by, I think when the coalition government came in, they wanted there to be a sort of yet another bonfire of the Quangos was augured. And immediately Lisa went to war because she was on the list of the bodies that were going to be dismantled. And she knew, because of the science that was coming down the road, that having a body that would be there to deal with pressing ethical issues was really important, and she argued for its permanence, and she fought it and won. And that was the kind of person she was. She was a great feminist, a great progressive, a great fighter for social justice. And I think that it's lovely that Jesus honours her in this way by having this annual lecture. Now, there isn't one of you who hasn't sort of been following the Brexit. It's on every lip, as indeed is the fact that we have a man like Trump in the White House. And I wanted to really start by talking about how they can be seen as phenomenon of our time, and the hope is, of course, that they will pass, that a point will come where we no longer have Trump in the White House. It is an inevitability, giving terms of office, but Brexit may live with us longer, depending on what happens over the next months. But for me as a lawyer, they point to something much more deep and perverse and profoundly damaging about what is happening in our world. And so it's not just about the rise of populism, because populism in a way is a symptom of what I see as being perhaps the deeper problem. And I think it does relate to globalisation, but a particular form of globalisation which is founded on an economic methodology which does embed injustice and huge gaps between rich and poor. But it relies very much on a reduction of the state, and it relies upon deregulation in order to maximise profit. And that assault on law is one that we're seeing in many, many different places. It's about a way of seeing the world and about reducing the rules-based order that was so carefully pieced together after the two world wars that we had in the 20th century. So we've had 70 years of slowly and with hard work been building up a world which was a world that was being directed towards a legal framework that protected peace and justice. And I am fearful that we're seeing that being dismantled. Now, I am currently chairing, I sit on the European Union Select Committee in the House of Lords, and I chair the European Union's committee that deals with justice issues. And so for the last 2 years, we've been working on all of the legal issues surrounding Brexit. And it has been a very challenging but fascinating time, because the extent to which we have built across Europe a framework of law both protective but also regulatory in really positive ways, is something that I think the majority of citizens in this country never came to understand. The ways in which consumers' rights are protected, the ways in which we're protected in the whole business of standards in medicine, in standards in fertilizers, so that we are not seeing the contamination of our environment. The ways in which we have seen the development of rules around the business of patent law and trademarks, so that you here in Britain, having some sort of invention, can be confident that the writ of law will protect it across the whole of Europe. The ways in which financial systems have been able to work successfully across this whole union. The ways in which people going on holiday, suffering injuries and suffering loss, for example, when hotels aren't built and so on, the ways in which we have simplified processes for claims in order for people not to have to find themselves an Italian or a Spanish lawyer to set about the business of seeking compensation. The ways in which a woman married to somebody who is perhaps an Italian, who has children and who then divorces, but who wants to receive maintenance for her children, doesn't have to, in pursuit of that maintenance, go to an Italian lawyer in an Italian court, but in fact can go to the local court in Bromley or in Cambridge and have an order made on maintenance that isn't being paid, and have the courts in Italy make that order effective because of the ways in which our mutual arrangements are so successfully working. So the dismantling of that whole business of the mutual arrangements that run across the whole of Europe is very serious. It's serious for me as someone who's a human rights lawyer, because we have developed very successful, through the European arrest warrant, we're able, on trafficking, for example, to successfully bring people to trial who are being harboured in other parts of Europe. We're also, through Eurojust, able to make decisions about where it is best to try someone, which legal system might be the more effective one in a particular set of circumstances, because in some places hearsay evidence rules are very different from the rules here, and it would be more successful to prosecute, for example, in Germany, someone who is the overlord of trafficking mafias that traffic people for many different purposes, that traffic in arms, that traffic in drugs, that traffic in arms, that traffic in fissile material, that traffic in organs, and that traffic in human beings for the purposes of domestic servitude, for underpaid and exploitative work, and for sexual purposes, as we know. So those we have across Europe warrants that can exist, but we also have protective orders, so that, for example, a woman who is being pursued by those who have trafficked her can actually go across to another part of Europe to live, and if she feels that she's being pursued by someone, then the warrant, the order that was made in a British court will have its writ will run in other parts of Europe, and she will phone the police and they will be able to deal with her as if the order had been obtained there. The ways in which that has slowly but carefully been put together over many, many years is something that we should be seeing as a benefit to citizens in this nation, but also in other nations too. But unfortunately, we're seeing the dismantling of that whole network as well. We're also seeing, because of the expansion of Europe, and our not having spent enough time working on the whole business of why the rule of law matters in a democracy, and in the business of a Marshall Plan to help those countries that came out of communism and who were putting together democracies, because no real work was done with them in looking at what the rule of law means. I'm afraid many of them are departing from what we would consider to be the standards that are required if the rule of law is to have meaning at all. And so the dismantling of those rules that were made in the post-Second World War period is something that I think should be a serious source of alarm to all of us. After the Second World War, you all know that the United Nations was created, conventions came into being which were for the protection of refugees, to make sure that people would not be rendered stateless, to make sure that the human rights of people would be protected. We had Bretton Woods putting together an economic system that would be more just and which would in fact try to create fairer societies. The European Declaration of Human Rights was very carefully constructed, bringing jurists from all around the world and from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds. The first of those meetings being in the drawing room of Eleanor Roosevelt in Washington Square in February of the year after the war ended. And she sat with people and she said, how can we have global law to make sure that we don't have global war? How do we make sure that legal systems are set to a certain standard and protect people from the horrors that we saw taking place during the Holocaust? And what was interesting about that challenge of how do you create global law was to answer that it's very difficult to make global law, but what you do is you draw upon, most societies draw upon their own deep-rooted cultural instincts for the sort of legal systems that they create, but you can create a template against which every legal system can be tested to see whether they're living up to the sort of values we would expect to see protected in legal systems. And so the question that was then asked was not how do you make global law, but was what are the values that we think should be imbued into the rule of law if it's to have meaning. And some of you will remember a film that was made which was called Justice at Nuremberg, and it had Spencer Tracy starring as the wise judge brought in to hear the trial of judges who in Germany had overseen law which basically meant that they were complicit with the Nazis in a sort of destructive machine of the Jewish people, but also any others who were seen to be in some way seen as enemies of the state. And when he was in this film, and of course it was a bit of romance was thrown in with Marlene Dietrich as the wife of a Nazi leader, but the film was really about the fact that judges too had taken part in this, and they felt justified in it. And the defences that they ran at that trial, and the film displays so clearly, is that they all said, we were only administering law. We were administering the rule of law because those laws were were passed by elected parliaments, and so what else were we to be doing other than administering law that was on the statute books of Germany at that time? And of course the answer to that is that law is more than something technocratic. Law is more than the word of what is passed in a statute by a parliament, and for it to be the bedrock of a nation, and for it to be the bedrock on which we build good societies, it has to be about something more. And so Eleanor Roosevelt's challenge was to say, well, how do you make it more? How do you imbue values and ethics into this? And that was the debate that took place over the weeks and months that followed before the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was to say that you ask the question, what does it mean to be human? How do you protect people, not just as citizens, but protecting the humanity of each and every one of us? How do we go about doing that? What is it that people need to flourish as human beings? And of course, it's pretty obvious. We answer it by saying they need freedom and liberty until you start trying to unpack what those individual words mean. What do we mean when we talk about the entitlement that people must have to health care, to a life that is not about being absolutely undermined by poverty and inhumanity? And of course they started saying, well, what you need to thrive is that you need to have your right to life protected, that you need to not to be tortured. And torture is one of those fundamentals that are protected in conventions and in the human right fabric, because we know, all of us know, what it is like to feel pain. And we also know that the business of torture is as demeaning to those who torture as it is to those who are at the receiving end of torture, because of the ways in which it does dehumanize. And that business of the need that any human being has, that yearning to love and to be loved, which is in fact at the base of the right to family life, and which has now given rise to the calls that should cover any loving and not just the ones that were considered acceptable in the past. And so the right to privacy, the right to freedom of speech, so that we can exchange views and ideas in order to perfect our society and to live better and to be tolerant of each other. The right to have freedom of religion, the right to be able to flourish as a human being in whatever way you want to give meaning to your life. And one of the great books of the last 20 years, I think, was that was written by Tom Bingham, the late president of our Supreme Court. He wrote a book called The Rule of Law. And in that book, he really does say that it's not a standalone concept, that it has to be that human rights imbue that whole sense of law as being the second pillar in a civilized society. And that law is about more than simply rules. And so, as I always see it, it's about that template, and any system should be tested against it. And of course, we fail all the time. And at the very time when it was created, the Universal Declaration spoke to the failings of our world, because we had colonized large parts of Africa and Asia, and even closer to home, we had in America, Jim Crow laws still existed, and racism and a form of apartheid still operated. We had gulags in Russia, the horrors in our world. No one came to the table with clean hands. No nation could claim that they had perfected the way of respecting each human being. But it was about our efforts to move in that direction over the years that followed. Well, I think that journey has been a good and pretty solid, slow and not fast enough for many of us, but a journey that was taking place. I remember that by the end of the 20th century, as we were approaching the millennium, we had that great moment when General Pinochet was arrested, and we agreed that there was universal jurisdiction for those who had committed crimes against humanity. And he was arrested in Britain, you'll remember, and all the way to our Supreme Court went his case. Eventually, it was agreed that his Alzheimer's was going to make having a trial a pretty difficult thing, and he was able to eventually return to Chile, where I'm told that he kind of lived on perfectly happily and functioning with his brain perfectly well, having done 3 somersaults on the tarmac as he got off the plane. But it did send out a message to Suharto and to many other people in parts of the world that, you know, your life was going to have, you know, you were going to be haunted by the things that you did. And many of us in the world, in the legal profession, who were involved with human rights, saw that as a point in time where we thought we were reaching a high mark. We were getting to a place where people couldn't, with impunity, commit these crimes. Well, just think about what's been happening recently. I'd like you to just think about what's been happening. And I'm afraid that it doesn't augur well for the business of law. And it's partly, of course, that we've been seeing and I relate it, of course, to globalisation, and I'm not saying anything original in saying that. But the form of globalisation, which has, in many ways, insisted upon a reduced state and the protections that often go with that. But it's also meant a drive towards deregulation. And have no doubt that that is what Brexit is. It is essentially an elitist globalisation project which has wrapped itself in the flag of nationalism and populism. It's been telling people this is actually a way of attacking elites, those metropolitan elites and those people at Cambridge and places who run our world, when in fact it actually has been about looking after the corporate interests, the financial interests, which are very committed to deregulating. Now, of course, not all kinds of deregulation is being sought by those who want to see reduced regulation, but a lot of it is to do with employment rights, which have, over a painful, lengthy struggle, have been created, but other kinds of rights too, about standards, about saying that it's about choice. You can choose. I heard the man who runs those public houses, Tim, not remembering his name. I heard him the other day saying, well, you know, if there's beef that's contaminated with hormones and so on, and there's beef that isn't, you just have to have a label on it in the supermarket, and people can choose. You know, you can buy the cheap stuff with the hormones, or you can buy the nice organic stuff that doesn't have hormones. And what we know is that, of course, in making those choices, it will be the poor who will be buying that which is going to affect their health and their well-being and so on. But, of course, it's a way of reducing what has been, in the words of despise, reducing the nanny state. That choice should be the ultimate consideration. And when it was pointed out that this may have a serious impact on farmers in Britain who don't, and who are, you know, raise beef and so on, that who don't operate to those kind of standards, the answer was, well, it may be that they'll have to go to the wall, that businesses don't survive. If you can't compete, you don't survive. And that, I'm afraid, is the sort of dog-eat-dog world that is being described for us. So my concerns about all of this is that you only have to look around to see the ways in which this process, which was I think, advancing the decency of our world and our responsibility one to the other, is being rolled back. And it's partly to do with, of course, the fact that we are seeing strongmen leaders around the world who basically, for quite conscious reasons, describe themselves as being countering elitist groupings, that they are speaking for the people against the enemies of the people. And that word, enemies of the people, keeps popping up. We had it here, of course, when our senior judiciary were making decisions about whether Parliament should have a final say, because we live in an elective democracy, whether Parliament should have a say on making decisions about Brexit. And the headline, of course, in the Daily Mail was enemies of the people, speaking about our senior judiciary in the most defamatory way. But of course, it's not that terminology we've heard being used also in the United States and also in other parts of Europe, and I'll take us through it. But that whole sense in which casting the judicial profession as the antithesis of the democratic imperative has been very successful, and it should alarm us because of what it means. Duterte has called for the removal of the Philippines' highest judicial officer. This is the guy who's gone to war on drugs and so on in the Philippines. But if you talk to ordinary Filipinos and people who have got family back there, they will tell you about the ways in which people are now living in fear. In an unprecedented move, the Supreme Court of the Philippines removed its own Chief Justice after Duterte, the president, called for her removal. And he labelled her. He said she was the enemy. And the UN Special Rapporteur on judicial independence said Duterte's statements and her eventual ouster were all directly related. And he said, well, the Special Rapporteur from the UN could go to hell. And that undermining of the international processes for trying to speak to governments about lessening the standards that we would expect to see is now itself being unravelled. Duterte's unapologetic rhetoric and intimidation tactics have cowed members of the judiciary in the Philippines into silence. And that's what happens, is that people then start silencing themselves. Bolsonaro. I've just come back from Brazil yesterday, where we had been doing, I run the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association, which has bar associations all around the world. We have associated to us 170 bar associations. And Bolsonaro has called for the Brazilian Supreme Court to be purged and upended. And in fact, the judge who tried and prosecuted Lula, the previous president, has now been appointed to be the Minister of Justice. And when I was there in Brazil, I was there really to look at programs that we've been running of training the judiciary around the abuse of prisoners, the ways in which in police stations up and down the country, following on from the habit of torture, the ways in which people are still cruelly beaten when they're arrested, and it's a shortcut to getting evidence. You just get people to confess to crimes, not always ones that they've committed. And so we've been doing work on torture and on the ending of this kind of violence towards prisoners and people who are arrested. And the judiciary had been cooperated in it, and we're now anxious that there may be an end to that sort of work, which is about sharing of experience, which we have to remember that we can tell a story about some of the bad things that happened in the years of the Irish Troubles, where we ended up being taken to the European Court because of practices in Northern Ireland. And so by explaining that, systems can fall down, but you have to then sort of pull yourself back up again, it's a way of having a conversation which is about mutuality. It's not about saying this is how you should do things, but you share experience. And the judges were very open to it, but we're now seeing that many of those judges who wanted to be learning about the creation of human rights standards are in fact being purged from the judiciary. The Law and Justice Party in Poland has embarked on a campaign of overreach, testing the foundations of the separation of powers. And again, an overt attempt to exert direct control over the judiciary, with the newfound power to appoint most members of the council that appoints judges. And so it's all political appointees who get to appoint the judges. And they're now reforming the Supreme and Ordinary Courts, basically to politicise them. And so and there's a disciplining process being introduced so that if judges are seen not to be performing in the way that the state wants or the government wants, that they can be easily removed. And what we all know is easy removal is one of the things that is an alarm call about not giving independence to judges. And of course we have Orban in Hungary playing with mandatory retirement. He's brought greater appointment powers to himself. He's ransacked the judicial profession, and he's removed inconvenient judges, and he's stacked the bench with his allies. And he's the man who, of course, is saying, what is all this business about liberal democracies? There's nothing wrong with an illiberal democracy, and he's invented this new entity to which other, I'm afraid, nations like Italy are now sort of being rather attracted. For years, Erdogan's government in Turkey has dismissed or reassigned judges to frustrate corruption inquiries. And then, recently, of course, after this alleged coup, emergency powers, post-coup, gave the authorities a blank cheque to, again, dismiss huge numbers of judges. More than 4,000 judges and prosecutors were dismissed. 4,000. And it's very interesting because I only a few weeks ago was in Turkey. We've been doing work at the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights on the treatment of lawyers. Lawyers in Turkey at the moment, there are more journalists in jail than in any other country in the world. Erdogan has locked up huge numbers of journalists and academics. The universities again have been absolutely gone through with a fine comb, and they've got rid of huge numbers of sacked many and imprisoned many public intellectuals and so forth. And lawyers who represent people in those cases then become subject of inquiry and suspicion. And we've have close connection with lawyers in Turkey who are really being harassed, threatened, and at times charged with criminal offences. And one of the problems with the whole thing of Turkey is that the European processes, because they belong to the Council of Europe, and the processes have not yet been effective in most of these cases. Tens of thousands of Turkish cases have been submitted to the European Court of Human Rights, and basically they're dismissed because there is a rule which is that you have to exhaust domestic remedies. But the problem is that you can't exhaust domestic remedies in Turkey at the moment because they don't allow the cases to go through to the highest court. And they basically block the movement, and the delays are such that when you try to then circumvent that, then the ECHR, but basically it's been about a lack of proactivity because they don't want to foster a sort of hostility towards the court and towards the Council of Europe, and they're hoping to somehow keep Turkey in its embrace. And it's that business of how far do you make concessions to tyranny, because you're thinking that by being nice to people, you might be able to have some sort of effect. But I was there a few weeks ago because of the killing of Khashoggi. The United Nations rapporteur on extrajudicial killing started up the beginnings of an investigation into the Khashoggi murder. And I was part of the team as the lawyer, and we had a senior police officer and a pathologist and a technical advisor. And we went out to, because the Turks had invited the UN in. They claim that they want an international inquiry. But there's something, it sticks in the throat when you're going to a place which itself is so abusive of human rights, is not doing this because they're particularly interested in the human rights of Khashoggi and concerned about his murder, but because there's some way in which they want to extract benefits from the Saudis, probably in relation to the Kurds, who are protected at the moment by the Saudis in Syria. And so there are machinations taking place and undercurrents which are nothing to do with law and are to do with political advantage. And so this horrible killing which took place, which was using diplomatic immunity and the whole system of law that we have around diplomacy around the world, where people have protection. If you go to your consulate, that they will give you assistance, that it's a place in which of sanctuary and a place in which there will be protections. And for that reason, immunity is given to diplomats, and this was an abuse of that immunity in order to give impunity to the people who were doing this killing. And this was not some accidental death. This was a team of 15 high-level intelligence officers, and a sort of SWAT team came from Saudi to Turkey. 9 on a private aeroplane, came in and within 24 hours had left the country, and this man has disappeared and his body never been found. And if it weren't for the illegality of the interception of the Turks listening in to the embassy, then I wouldn't have heard the actual tape of the killing of this man. And you hear the terrible cries of a human being being murdered by these people. And then we know that and you can hear, because they discuss the cutting up of his body. So, that sense of bravado, that you can go into another country and do that, just in the same way that Putin has felt impunity about being able to do the same kind of thing with his intelligence officers coming here and going to Salisbury to deal with one of the enemies of his state. That business, that law somehow is meaningless to these people, is something that should be a source of concern to us. And yet, we've been very quiet on the business of Saudi's criminality. And we know, the evidence is there, that it goes right up to the top levels of government. But of course, Mr. Trump, uninhibited by the sort of decorum that our own Foreign and Commonwealth Office would display, says very openly, there's £50 billion worth of trading arrangements here, and that matters more to me than human rights. I mean, basically, that was what he said. And so we should be concerned with the ways in which law is becoming less significant. And the institutions that we were relying upon to do things about it are on the back foot. We know that because the United Nations just now and indeed the Human Rights Council is feeling absolutely paralysed because the United States has left the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. We had Trump recently about to appoint a television presenter from Fox News to be the representative on the UN, which is saying something about how seriously they consider the UN to be. We had Netanyahu recently, when Ban Ki-moon tried to phone him about a matter that they were concerned about, refusing to take his phone call, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And so the ways in which we've seen a diminishment of the status of these organs that we created in order to pursue peace and justice in our world. And so with the whole business of, here we have it happening in Europe, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the ways in which the fascist parties are rising up in Europe, and the usual judicial checks and balances are being unravelled in the dealing with many of these things. And just before coming in here, I was speaking to one of your emeritus professors, and we were talking about the ways in which the conventions that were created for the protection of refugees are also becoming meaningless. And of course we know that the reason why is because there's more and more conflict in our world, and there will be more conflict around resources and the sharing of resources. But we also know that climate change is going to create more and more problems around places turning into deserts and people being drowned by the rise of sea levels around the edges of their nations. And the movement of people to places of safety and places where they might be able to survive is going to become greater by the year. And yet we do not deal with these things because the pursuit of exploiting minerals, of using fossil fuels, the ways in which we have elevated money to be the highest value, the highest ideal, the way in which that has taken over the considerations of government everywhere, and the corporate role in all of that, I think, is really going to pay a terrible price for us, because law in the process is disappearing and is shrinking in its areas, except in the areas where we punish those whom we might see as being a threat to our personal security. So I'm here as the bearer of bad news, because I think that I do think that this has been a process. And we started badly here in the UK. We started badly as the century turned, and in 2001, 9/11 took place. And then in response to 9/11, instead of recognising that the rule of law means that you have to have due process and so on, what did we do? We introduced detention without trial. We introduced rendition, and I'm afraid we're party to it. And we introduced many different erosions of the standards within our system, which had to be remedied by the very fine Supreme Court that we have here in the UK. And we have a really good judicial system, but it needs to be protected. And we know that left to tabloid newspapers, those protections will not be sustained. We have to be the protectors of our judiciary, our independent legal profession, because if you don't have independent lawyers, then of course it's independent lawyers who represent the people in societies that perhaps wouldn't be given due process. It's independent lawyers who go on to become independent judges, and it's independent lawyers who speak out for the legal system and for the independence of judges when they see it being attacked, and can do so with the voice of experience of working in the courts and why it matters so much. And yet here we are, destroying a legal aid system that gives access to justice to the many. And it's a way in which we have stopped seeing how these things are the mortar that hold societies together. We have the United States now withdrawing from not just the Human Rights Council, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the whole business of building walls, keeping migrants out, followed in by other countries in the world. And I'm afraid that the UN is being silent because it is fearful for its own survival. So don't think that these things cannot happen here, because I just want to give you some bad news, which is that today, there was in the report in the newspapers the decision in the Chagos Islanders case, because we have islands there in the middle of I think it's in the Indian Ocean. And the International Court of Justice found that it was colonised by us, Britain, a very long time ago, and that we really should turn it back to the people who are indigenous to it. And when asked today what the government's view was of this decision, was that it was purely advisory. Well, I remember that we had a referendum that was purely advisory, and somehow words mean different things if you play them differently. But of course, part of the problem is that there's an air base on it, and it's rented to the United States of America, and the United States of America use these islands for the refueling of their aeroplanes, and they, of course, were used as darks. There was a dark site there during the period of rendition, and it was one of the places to which people were brought, either on their way to places where there they would be tortured, or indeed even to experience waterboarding. And so I want to just mention finally the business of, we've just seen in this business of creating a withdrawal, a piece of legislation to withdraw from the European Union, we abandoned the Charter of Rights that was part and parcel of our membership of the European Union. That's different from the European Convention of Human Rights, which is a totally separate thing. There's a Council of Europe which has 46 members, unlike the European Union, which has its 28 if you count us. But the Council of Europe created the European Convention of Human Rights. This country, we Britain, our lawyers drafted the European Convention of Human Rights, and of course it was a post-war creation, drawing on the inspiration of the Universal Declaration. And the idea was that this was law which would apply across all the nations and would bind us all. And we, of course, for a long time didn't want to join in because we felt that we didn't need it. And then eventually we did sign up to it, and we now have the Human Rights Act. However, there have been for a long time people who've not liked the idea of being part of the European Convention on Human Rights. And some of the most reactionary tabloid newspapers have had a war of attrition against the Human Rights Act. And indeed, sections of the Conservative Party, which in fact are the very same sections which are running the hardest line on Brexit, don't like the European Convention on Human Rights either, and have been advocating for a long time for us to withdraw from the European Convention and certainly to get rid of the Human Rights Act. And of course, what is said is, well, we'll have our very own Bill of Rights, we'll have our own British Bill of Rights, but it will make a difference between people who are true-born Englishmen and those damn foreigners. And so this sort of hierarchy of rights would be maintained in it. And so there's been a great struggle around the business of human rights. And for many people, talking about the European Court of Justice, which is the European Union's court, was conflated with the European Court of Human Rights. And the cases, if you speak to people and you say, what are the cases in the European Court that you don't like, that are making you want to leave the European Union? And they say, that business of that horrible preacher, we couldn't get rid of him and it was all because they thought he would be tortured. Torture's too good for him. And then it would be about prisoners' rights. Why should prisoners be allowed to vote? And of course, the European Court of Human Rights had not said that all prisoners should be entitled to vote. And what they were saying is that blanket bans are not good. Blanket bans go with fascism. Blanket bans in the history of places that had authoritarian governments did not feel good. And therefore, it weren't there people who went to prison for low-level sentences whom you want to have included and continue to include in the embrace of being a citizen, and therefore to make sure that they maintain the rights that go with citizenship. And so that it would have been perfectly easy for a government in Britain here to say, we will make sure that people who are only sent to prison for a year or 2 years have the right to vote, and they can have a postal vote, whereas anybody more serious won't be allowed to do it. That would have, all honour would have been served, but no, it couldn't be given into. And those are the cases that are always referred to when you talk about the European Court of Justice, which was not the court that dealt with those matters. It was the European Court of Human Rights. And if you say even to ministers in government, tell me a case in the European Court of Justice that you really don't like, and they can't tell you because they don't know. And that's the interesting thing. But the real problem with the European Court of Justice is that it deals with employment rights. It was dealing with trying to create standards across the whole of Europe, because there were concerns that people would say they'll just bring people over who are going to be paid really low wages, and they're just going to try and undercut. And there won't be protections for people who are part-time workers. Women particularly benefit from judgments that were made in the European Court of Justice around the protections for part-time workers, that they too can have holiday pay, that they too can have sick pay if they've worked in a place for a certain period of time. And so those protections are ones that employers often are not very keen on. Maternity rights. a real hostility to the idea that women should have maternity rights. And of course, in the United States, if you go and speak to people in the United States, there's very little in the way of maternity rights for citizens of America, of North America. So all I would say to you is that the dislike of the European Court of Justice is deliberately conflated in the minds of people because the European Court of Justice is the real problem is around the protections that there are for employees, for workers, because the gig economy works far better for those who are employers. So I think that we should be mindful of the fact that just now we have a withdrawal agreement that is being placed before Parliament, or eventually, or might be at the 11th hour, placed before Parliament for Parliament to vote on it. And that withdrawal treaty has with it a political declaration. And the political declaration, the European Union has said, are you promising that you will remain, because you've got rid of the Charter of Human Rights, which is around the European Union, will you maintain the European Convention of Human Rights and your commitment to that in order to reassure us that that tapestry is not going to be undermined too? And it started off, the first draft said, there was a commitment to remain within the European Convention on Human Rights, and the second draft of the not the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration has changed its language to say that there will be every effort will be made to maintain with the general meaning of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the change of wording is a flag to tell us all what is really intended. And what is really intended is really to remove, ultimately, ourselves from the protections of our human rights. Now, why do human rights matter? They matter because of the very reasons that I've been speaking about. They matter because they recognise the humanity of each and every one of us. And it's not just been, majoritarianism. The law that's passed by a majority in Parliament sometimes can be very vicious towards minorities, but it sometimes can forget that the individual can be different one from the other. And the use of the Human Rights Act has been very important in being able, for example, to have postmortems and inquests into the deaths of people in police stations. It's been possible for us to have inquests into young soldiers who've died in certain barracks where there was bullying and intimidation and where they ended up committing suicide, and where the backdrop of that then became public. Some of the ways in which the Human Rights Act has been used has been of benefit to many people who might have been surprised by the fact that it could be used to their benefit. The protection of the elderly in old people's homes, where they were being abused, or where they were being separated from the person that they'd lived with for 50 years of their lives because of the savings to local authorities. Many different kinds of case where the Human Rights Act has acted as being a protection for individuals living within our nation. And so I just want to say to you, there is something happening in our world. And what is happening is an erosion of that great framework that was being created after the war, and which was worked at and was being built upon slowly, accretion by accretion, but trying to make the world a better and safer place. And I'm afraid that we are seeing at the moment a stepping away from that. And I think it will be to the detriment of us all. And so what I'm saying to all of you is it requires our vigilance. It requires our alertness to the fact that these things are happening. And while we have them, I think, one of the finest judiciaries in the world, I think probably the finest, I think that we have a really good legal system. I think that those things can disappear very easily if you're not careful. And taking away legal aid, reducing the access to justice for many people, like prisoners, like people who are on welfare, not being able to get legal advice because there's no money for it, using the excuse, taking 40% out of the Justice Department's budget, I think it tells you something about how seriously law is being taken. Thank you.
do have a bit of time for questions, and there are mic runners up above and below. Did I see one over here at the back? If you could wait till you get the microphone, that would be very helpful. If the next person could put their hand up, we can get the mic to them.
Of many.
It's not working. I think you need to find it, get it switching on.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming to Jesus this evening and for the wonderful lecture.
Coming to Jesus.
Of the many things you said in the course of the lecture that I found fascinating, one thing really struck me, and that was the statement that law is more than the technocratic and more than the rules that we write in statutes. And I agree with you. So I would love to have your opinion on, as you know, the sort of push to replicate ever more aspects of the legal system and judicial decision-making with AI and algorithmic decision systems, because we are seeing through that a sort of erosion of the juridical realm. And how do you see that sitting with what you identify as this gradual sort of ebbing away of the importance of law in society as it's replaced with computation?
Well, I mean, it's so interesting. I had the opportunity of having a quick word with you before in the reception, and you were telling me about your own work on law and basically technology and artificial intelligence. I think there's a serious drift in that direction, and it's very worrying because decision-making is, sometimes it's about more than what an algorithm is capable of, and we also know that the algorithms very much depend on who are making the algorithms, and there's already evidence certainly coming through from other institutions. I know that there's some of the work at Harvard has shown that, for example, the use of algorithms in job applications has been shown to be racially discriminating, and certainly there's gender discriminating at times. And so there are ways in which those who make the algorithms, and by and large they're young white men, tend to be based on things that we're not even conscious of. And I mean, I've just written a book in which I'm really taking the judges to task on unconscious biases that exist in our society, where gender inequality still exists and has existed in the courts forever in my years of practice, and how judges have become much more aware, and the agendas have changed, and judges are trying to sort of deliver fairness, and we introduce things into the legal system in a form of reform, but those deep wells of sort of invisible stuff that actually inform how we approach problems, what we think about people, how we assess people, those things live on. So many people sort of say, well, surely algorithms will improve our lot, isn't it? We could ride this out, we could get women to create the algorithms and maybe they'll redress that balance. But actually, I'm not convinced yet that is possible. And there is something about the human being sitting and judging other human beings. There's something in that process, and it's why I'm a big believer in the jury, because the coming together of 12 people and pooling their knowledge and experience. And that isn't to say that I'm not at times disappointed, and particularly around the attitudes towards sexuality and towards issues of gender. But I still do think that you can speak to the better part of people, and you can say, leave stuff behind. Ask yourself, what would you want for you or your children if you were here facing a jury, and what the standards would be. And I don't want to lose that. Now, people say that it's just that I'm an old-fashioned girl, but I mean, I do think there's something in that process that makes it better. And to have justice delivered by computer, I think, that's a future that I'm glad that I won't be practicing in. So I think it's worrying. But I really look forward to seeing your work as we go forward. But I do think that in all of this, one of the things that I've written about recently is about how certainly courtrooms are changing by virtue of the technological advances that have been made over the last 20 years. I mean, but particularly the last 10. The business of us all having in our pockets a telephone which basically can do so much and contain so much of our information. And the disinhibiting thing of social media, where people put stuff on it that they think it's intimate, so they share it, young women share intimacies with a boyfriend, and then the relationship ends, and then suddenly they're exposed to whole groups of friends, and there's revenge porn, or there's ways in which it comes back to bite them when they come to give evidence in a courtroom and their social media has gone through, and they're asked if they're really the rather prim young woman that they are presenting to the jury, and just take a look at your photographs on, And so there are ways in which this technology is changing the processes in courtrooms. And now there isn't a case that I do where a huge amount of the time is taken up by examining people's social media, but also contacts that are made. You can often work out something. I mean, if we were to go back to the Khashoggi case, the business of who speaks to whom within 10 minutes of somebody being murdered tells you something about the nexus and the networks of people who have been involved in decision making. And so many of those, even if you don't get to read the content, the fact of the communication is and the link being made. But then, of course, we know that all sorts of illegality is happening in the listening in, because they're hoovering up all these connections and communications. It's not a secret that the head of intelligence in Turkey said to me when I said, "Have you got MBS linked? Have you got anything? Have you got a phone link?" And he looked at me and smiled and said, "You ask your intelligence agencies."
Any more questions? I see there's one over here, one at the front there, and one over here. So we may have to have shortish answers to. Were you trying to?
Thank you very much. Just reflecting on your comments about the Brexit movement having wrapped itself in the flag of populism and nationalism, I think that messaging from the elite to sell that campaign has been so effective in undermining trust in multilateralism and in international standard setting and in the international and supranational institutions that impose and that regulate those standards. Is it possible to start to restore broader faith in multilateralism at a grassroots level, or is this something that we really need elites to message and to lead in order to, I guess, promote international rule of law and just broader, I guess, faith in that concept?
It's so interesting because now that I'm a sort of an older lawyer, a lot of the stuff that I now do is about trying to put together programs where we're invited in. Speaker, please. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't mindful of that. Yes. No. That's you're right. Now that I'm involved in programs of law reform and in exchanges with people around trying to create that kind of understanding of how international law can be used, even in domestic courts, to your advantage. And very few lawyers in places like, in Palestine or in Uzbekistan, they don't know that they could actually be arguing about some of the international conventions that provide protections and reminding courts and reminding judges that actually there's something bigger here that's about that speaks to values that are universal. And there's a hunger in the law schools in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, and so on. They want to learn this stuff, and so they really want younger program lawyers and trainers to come in and to just exchange and talk about how could I use that in a case that I'm doing. If I'm representing a journalist, how can I do that? And so it's very interesting. There is a new generation that I think are going to be opened to revitalising that sense that we have to keep standards high. And so I'm not totally pessimistic. It's just that I think we're going to go through quite a bad time to get to the new, to the place that we thought we already were. And so I think it's going to be a struggle. But in parts of the world where horrible things are happening, people are so courageous and so wonderful. And young lawyers in those parts of the world need as much support as we can give them, and young journalists, because they really are being incredibly courageous in taking a stand against oppressive governments. And these are governments that pretend that they're democracies, and we talk about them as if they're democracies. And of course they're not democracies, and they're exactly what Orban would say. They're illiberal democracies, and they only formally fulfill the idea of a democracy by having a vote. But none of the other things, of having a proper opposition, of having a free press, of having a vibrant civil society, none of those exist, and an independent judiciary and lawyers who are not going to be attacked simply because they represent people. We were all brought up as lawyers in Britain on the idea of the Erskine principle. And the Erskine principle was that Tom Paine, back in the day when he was a pamphleteer and was talking about the rights of man and publishing pamphlets about it, he was, done for sedition. That he was trying to promote insurgency against the king, and Erskine, who was a sort of great advocate of the time, acted for him and said, "I despise everything that you believe in, the idea of the rights of man and flattening out society and as not having the hierarchy as it was in Britain then," and said, "But law depends on people being properly represented." And so when I was doing the IRA trials and I was representing people accused of terrorism, I was always able to say, you represent people and you don't decide on the merits of their case and whether you believe in what they believe in. You're doing it because you're protecting your legal system for everybody. And it's so important, and that message somehow gets lost. And the assumption then, of course, grows that people only represent people that that are in sympathy with. And I always remember that after 9/11, going to a sort of a big seminar in Berlin, and there were people from different parts of the world, and it was a sort of high-level discussion on terrorism. And I had, of course, done a lot of terrorism over the years. And at some point, I said, "Listen, I've acted for I had acted for a group of people who were plotting a bomb, who were young Muslims, just before this. And I said, I've acted for some of these young people. And, it's not, to some extent, it's about being in a gang. It's about somehow yearning for a sense of belonging to something. And somebody turned around and said, "Shame on you." And I said, "I beg your pardon, representing these people?" And I have to tell you, it was an American. And I had to remind him about the rule of law. And I did so in no uncertain terms. But lots of people don't seem to appreciate that it's not for the protection just of the people you're acting for. It's for all of us. It's about keeping law good, that people then are represented, they're represented well, and then a jury makes a decision, or a court, whatever it may be. In different systems it's different. And then a person is sentenced having had a due process. And they've been well represented, and represented by lawyers who are being fearless in criticising at times the state and the behaviour of state actors. But we have to understand that we're not doing it for the individuals on trial, we're doing it for all of us, because it's a protection for all of us. And so once we start disrupting that, you're disrupting something fundamental to the good society.
We're almost out of time, I'm afraid, and I did say there were two questions here. So what I might do, if both of you want to have the question, if you could do them very, very quickly.
One after the other.
And then the challenge is to answer both of them together.
Yeah, okay.
And the other one was at the front.
This gentleman here.
So you attribute this deterioration to inequality, which I'm sure is correct. Mm. I was wondering if you think it might also be due to a backlash against the flaws of the human rights system. For example, the fact that economically powerful states use it to exercise soft power, and the fact that human rights are so universal and they don't allow for any sort of cultural difference.
So if I get the second question, then I'll try and get you to answer both of them.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of the separation of powers, since the creation of a justice ministry, selection of judges in this country is now indirectly but structurally within the purview of the executive. Does that disturb you?
Well,
do both of them.
I'm going to do both of them. I'm going to do, first of all, It is about inequality, but it's not just about, it's about inequality created by, I think, an economic system that is absolutely drives towards inequality. The fact that we have, so few people, a small number of people who are massively rich, and that whole sort of notion of trickle-down benefits, and which has all been untrue, and that chasm that's grown up between rich and poor has led to a desire by ordinary people for something better, which allows that gap to be entered by the strong authoritarian leader who then starts, disrupting. And the word disruptive is seen as being a good word. We have to put an end to those old ways. I agree that there's a certain amount of criticism of the human rights order and the hypocrisy of states, the way in which, Saudi can do what it likes because we need to be trading with them, because they buy all our airplanes so that they can kill Yemenis. But, there's something horrifying about all of that. The fact that we keep zipped up when we're in China trying to get trade deals, and we'll be doing more of that as we leave Europe. I mean, if we go off the deep end and had no deal, then you can be damn sure we will be doing business with the worst dictators in the world. So there is a profound dishonesty about all of that stuff, I know. What I don't quite agree with you about, though, is and I think that people therefore distrust it, but I think that one of the things I don't agree about is that when you go and you speak to people, people know about their own human rights and they care about them. And I don't believe in this business about cultural, that it's insensitive, it's a Western creation and it's insensitive to cultural difference. FGM, female genital mutilation, taking away somebody's clitoris, the idea we kept being told that was about, we should be respecting other people's cultures. No, we are not going to be respecting that as a cultural thing, because it was devised by men about retaining women, as virginal brides and child brides at that. And so there are many of these things that are done, particularly around the abuses of women, and culture is used as the excuse for doing it. We can't be silent on that. And it doesn't matter that women are culturated to believe that it's a good thing too. We have to speak out when we see cruel things being done to other human beings. And so I think that the people who usually say those things are people who benefit from those abuses, and it's usually not the victims of the abuses. But I think there are problems about the human rights system. Don't kid yourself. And I think there's problems with the UN. It's just that, it's like democracy. You have to try and think of anything better, and what we're being offered is not better. Sir, on the business of the reform of the Lord Chancellor's role in this country was a disaster. A total disaster, and it was done for the worst of all reasons. It was done because of a personal conflict between two main players. In that Tony Blair got sick of Derry Irving because he was a patronising fool who didn't and spoke all the time about Tony Blair being his pupil, and would snap his fingers and say more claret at this end of the table when he went to Chequers. So Blair got rather irritated by him. But the real conflict was between law and order. It was between Derry Irving as the Lord Chancellor, knowing that his role was to protect the judiciary from attack, and David Blunkett as the Home Secretary, who was attacking the judiciary all the time. And it became a running sore inside the Cabinet. And as a result, at one point when Blair had enough of it, he decided to come down on the side of Blunkett, and he said that he was making the Lord Chancellor redundant because he was doing away with the role. And it was done on the back of an envelope, and of course I think that it was to the detriment of our legal system, because it meant that we didn't have somebody who was going to really protect that very important and independent structure. And it has become too politicised in my view, and we now have Lord Chancellors who know nothing about legal systems, don't care about them, and Grayling was the worst example of it, and a horror show taking place inside the Justice Department. Any Justice Minister who felt that he could put his hand up and say, I'll take more cuts, and we had 40% cuts to the budget of the Justice Department. So you have courts being closed down everywhere, where the legal aid budget had to be slashed, where the poorest in society have no access to justice, and where, the whole thing is a disgrace. And so, yes, I agree with you.
And on that note, thank you very, very much for coming to give such a brilliant lecture, such a brilliant tribute to Lisa. So, thank you. The taxi's in about 2 minutes. For those of you who are watching online, I'm afraid that's it. For those of you in the room, there are drinks just outside that way on the ground floor. Thank you.